Rain had been tapping the metal roof of the Cascade Foothills Wildlife Sanctuary since before dawn, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the fir trees beyond the examination yard. By late afternoon, every cedar rail shone black with water, and the air smelled of wet bark, antiseptic, and wood smoke drifting from the burn scar east of Oak Ridge. Evelyn Mercer stood beneath the overhang, with both hands wrapped around a chipped green mug she had forgotten to drink from. At 72, she had learned how to wait beside pain without filling the silence. 38 years of nursing had taught her that. Retirement had not taken the habit from her. Even now, when nervous, she pressed her thumb along the mug's cracked handle as though checking a pulse. Across the yard, behind 2 layers of wire and a screen of damp salal, an elderly female bobcat watched her. The animal's coat had faded around the muzzle. One ear carried a small crescent-shaped notch. Her right hind leg rested lightly, never quite bearing her full weight. She held one forepaw curled inward beneath her chest, an old peculiar habit that reached through 10 years of absence and struck Evelyn more sharply than any name could have done. No one beside Evelyn spoke. Nolan Reyes, the sanctuary's senior rehabilitator, lifted one hand toward the younger volunteers, asking them to remain still. Evelyn's granddaughter, Mara, stood near the feed room door with rain caught in her dark hair. Even the visiting fire crew, who had brought the Bobcat down from the blackened ridge that morning, seemed to understand that the quiet belonged to something older than their questions. The Bobcat did not approach the fence. She remained low beneath a leaning cedar branch, shoulders tight, amber eyes fixed on Evelyn's face. Then, very slowly, she closed them. Not fully, not for long. One measured blink. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the mug. 10 winters fell away. She saw a faded blue blanket beneath a heat lamp. She heard sleet ticking against a clinic window. She remembered a young wild creature too frightened to sleep, watching every movement with eyes made of firelight. And she remembered the first time those eyes had softened, just enough to close and open again in the same deliberate way. "Juniper," Evelyn whispered. The old bobcat's ears shifted toward her voice. That tiny movement was all it took. Mara covered her mouth. One firefighter lowered his gaze. Nolan breathed out through his nose, the sound unsteady, despite all the animals he had released and lost during his years at the sanctuary. Evelyn did not cry immediately. Her feelings had never arrived noisily. They gathered behind her ribs instead, deep and warm and almost painful. She set the mug on the railing before her hands could betray her. There were rules for moments like this. No entering the enclosure, no reaching through the wire, no mistaking recognition for domestication. A wild animal's trust was not permission, and memory did not erase instinct. Evelyn knew each rule and felt grateful for them. Boundaries had once saved Juniper's life. They had also allowed her to remain herself. So Evelyn lowered herself onto the wooden bench beneath the overhang. Her knees complained. Mara took one step forward, ready to help, but Evelyn gave a small shake of her head. She wanted Juniper to see the movement completed in the old way, slowly, sideways, without a direct advance. 10 years earlier, she had spent countless hours sitting just so, near enough to be known, far enough not to threaten. The bench gave a familiar squeak. Juniper's whiskers angled forward. Nolan glanced at Evelyn. "She remembers the sound," he murmured. Evelyn looked at the bench as if it had performed a miracle. It always was too loud. Mara let out a quiet, tearful laugh. The warmth of that sound loosened the yard. Rain drummed against a bucket beside the shed. Somewhere inside the recovery building, a raven knocked something metal from its perch and seemed offended by the result. Juniper's gaze flicked toward the noise, then returned to Evelyn. That return mattered more than closeness. For several minutes, no one moved. Evelyn sat with her palms open on her coat, breathing slowly. The bobcat tested the air with short lifts of her nose. Once she turned toward the dark forest beyond the enclosure, where mist threaded between Douglas fir trunks. Her body leaned in that direction, answering a pull no human voice could replace. Evelyn noticed the pale hairs above her left eye and the broken whisker along her right cheek. Age had written itself gently but unmistakably across Juniper's face. While Evelyn had measured the missing years and birthdays, empty trail camera cards and unanswered hopes, Juniper had measured them in snowmelt, hunger, territory, fire, and survival. She had not been waiting to return, she had been living. That truth steadied Evelyn more than any dream of being remembered every day. Listeners who felt something stir in that quiet reunion were gently invited to like the story, subscribe, and share where they were watching from, along with the name of an animal that had once changed their life. The invitation passed as softly as the rain. Mara brought Evelyn's mug from the railing and placed it beside her. "Cold," she whispered. "It usually is by the time I remember it." That had been true during her hospital years. It had been true during Juniper's recovery. Some habits survived every version of a life. Juniper rose. The volunteers stiffened, but Nolan kept his hand low. The bobcat stretched one foreleg, then the other, her spotted back lifting beneath the wet gray light. She took 3 silent steps from beneath the cedar branch. Her injured leg moved carefully, though not helplessly. At the edge of the open ground, she stopped. She was still more than 20 feet away. Evelyn did not call again. Juniper sat, curled the same forepaw beneath her chest, and turned her face slightly aside. It was not surrender. It was not affection shaped for human understanding. It was the guarded ease of a wild creature deciding, for one breath and then another, that she did not need to flee. Evelyn's eyes filled at last. She smiled without wiping them. Across the rain-dark yard, Juniper gave her one more slow blink, and everyone who saw it understood why silence was the only respectful answer. The rain continued beyond the sanctuary roof, and while Juniper rested beneath the cedar branch, Evelyn's mind returned to the year before the rescue, when silence had first become something she feared. She had been 61 when Daniel Mercer died. For 42 years, Daniel had filled their cedar-sided house outside Oak Ridge with the small, steady noises of a man who disliked being idle. He sharpened kitchen knives every Sunday, whether they needed it or not. He whistled only the first 4 notes of an old folk song because he claimed the rest had escaped him. Each morning, he opened the back door before sunrise to smell the weather, then announced his findings as though the mountains had appointed him their official messenger. "Rain by lunch," he would say beneath a cloudless sky. Sometimes he was wrong. Evelyn never corrected him until after lunch. Their life had not been dramatic. It had been built from packed lunches, muddy boots, late hospital shifts, and arguments about whether a chair with one broken rung was still worth repairing. Daniel worked for the Forest Service, maintaining trails and fire roads. Evelyn spent 38 years as a nurse at a regional hospital, most of them in the medical surgical wing, where fear arrived in countless disguises. She learned to recognize it in clenched hands, in too many questions, and in the families who became suddenly fascinated by floor tiles. She learned to warm blankets before offering them. She learned that some patients wanted explanations, and others wanted someone to sit without speaking. Daniel understood that she carried pieces of those rooms home. On difficult nights, he left a chipped green mug beside the stove and did not ask what had happened. The mug had once belonged to his mother. A hairline crack ran down its handle, but Daniel insisted it made the cup easier to recognize. When Evelyn forgot her tea until it went cold, he warmed it without comment. After he died, the mug stayed cold. His illness had been brief enough to feel like an administrative error. One autumn, he had been repairing a gate near Salt Creek. By Christmas, he tired halfway across the living room. In February, Evelyn sat beside his hospital bed, knowing the meaning of every number on every screen and wishing she did not. She could help strangers face uncertainty because she had a task. She could check medication, adjust a pillow, call a physician, and place a cool cloth across a fevered brow. With Daniel, knowledge gave her no shelter. She saw every change before anyone explained it. She heard the spaces between the doctor's sentences. During his final evening, Daniel looked toward the dark window and asked whether it had started snowing. It had not. Evelyn told him it might. That was the last small kindness she could give him, weather that had not yet arrived. Snow fell the following morning. For several months afterward, she continued working. The hospital corridors offered structure. At 6:45, she tied back her silver-streaked hair, clipped a penlight to her pocket, and checked the assignment board. She still remembered which patients took their coffee sweet and which elderly men pretended not to need help walking. Her hands remained capable. Her heart did not feel capable at all. Then, during a quiet night shift, she found herself standing outside an empty room with 2 warmed blankets folded over her arms. The patient had already been discharged. Evelyn had read the board incorrectly, though she had checked it twice. She stood there longer than she should have. A younger nurse, named Priya Shah, gently took 1 blanket from the pile. "Come sit for a minute," she said. Evelyn tried to laugh. "I've been sitting for 38 years. People just keep putting wheels under the chairs." Priya smiled, but her eyes did not. A month later, Evelyn retired. Retirement sounded peaceful when other people described it. They spoke of gardening, books, and sleeping beyond dawn. Evelyn discovered that dawn came whether anyone needed her or not. She woke at 5:20 each morning, the same time as before. She made tea in the chipped mug. She opened the back door, as Daniel once had, and stood on the step while cold air moved through the firs. At first she tried announcing the weather aloud. "Fog along the ridge," she said one morning. The empty kitchen gave no answer. After that, she kept the forecasts to herself. She filled her days with practical things. She repaired loose buttons, reorganized the pantry, and walked the gravel lane to the mailbox, even when there was no mail worth collecting. She volunteered twice a week at the library, where she returned mystery novels to shelves and quietly corrected the children's craft supplies whenever someone mixed the blue paper with the green. The librarian, Beth Holloway, teased her about it. "The crayons don't require triage, Evelyn." "They might, if you keep putting broken ones back in the box." The exchanges made them both smile, but the smile rarely followed Evelyn home. Her closest neighbor, Walter Kim, began leaving vegetables on her porch. He grew far more zucchini than any sensible household could eat, and behaved as though Evelyn had personally requested each one. Once, he left a specimen so large that she used it to hold open the pantry door while carrying in groceries. Daniel would have approved of the improvisation. That thought hurt, then warmed her, then hurt again. Wildlife moved around the edges of those quiet months. Deer stepped through the orchard at dusk. A gray fox crossed the road with its tail held level. Once, near the woodpile, Evelyn spotted a bobcat crouched in winter grass, ears rotating independently as it listened beneath the snow. The animal did not look at her for long. It lifted one paw, placed it without sound, and disappeared between the young firs. Evelyn had admired that refusal to explain itself. She did not yet know another bobcat would soon teach her a harder lesson, that being needed was not the same as being loved, and that care sometimes mattered most when it ended in goodbye. At the sanctuary 10 years later, Juniper shifted beneath the cedar and groomed one rain-darkened shoulder with 3 deliberate strokes of her tongue. Then she paused, listening toward the forest. Evelyn watched her and pressed her thumb against the crack in the mud's handle. Daniel had been gone 11 years. The ache was still there, but it no longer occupied every room. The first time Evelyn saw Juniper clearly, the Bobcat was wedged beneath the eastern support of an old footbridge over Salmon Creek, half hidden by sleet and shadow. It was the week before Thanksgiving, 10 years earlier. The afternoon had darkened before 4, and wet cold had settled into the valley. Evelyn had spent the morning shelving books at the library, then driven home along Forest Road 19 with groceries on the passenger seat and a loaf of rye bread balanced on top. A fallen alder forced her to slow near the creek crossing. That was when she noticed the ravens. 3 stood along the bridge rail, feathers slick and black, looking down together. One hopped sideways and made a low, questioning sound. Another lifted away when Evelyn's headlights swept across it, but the other 2 remained. Daniel had taught her to pay attention when scavengers gathered without feeding. Sometimes it meant an animal was trapped. Sometimes it meant something was injured, but still alive enough to defend itself. Evelyn pulled onto the muddy shoulder. Sleet struck her coat like handfuls of sand. She took the flashlight from beneath the driver's seat and walked toward the bridge with one hand on the rail. At first, she saw only brown water moving around stones. Then 2 eyes caught the light. They were low beneath the bridge, close to the mud, amber and round. The animal did not move. Its ears flattened so completely that its spotted head seemed smaller than it was. Evelyn stopped. The Bobcat's front half was pressed against the concrete support. One hind leg lay at an angle beneath her, and rusted wire was twisted through the brush beside it. Burrs clung to the wet fur along her belly. She had thinned until the bones of her shoulders showed whenever she breathed. "Easy," Evelyn said, though she knew the word meant nothing. The Bobcat opened her mouth in a soundless warning. That silence frightened Evelyn more than a snarl would have. It suggested exhaustion. She backed away at once. Her nursing instincts urged her forward. Her common sense told her that a terrified wildcat could injure them both in seconds. Evelyn returned to the truck, shut the door against the sleet, and called the county wildlife office. The first call went to voicemail. The second connected her to a dispatcher who transferred her twice. Evelyn described the location, the wire, and the animal's shallow breathing. She was careful not to call the Bobcat tame or helpless. Neither word was true. "Stay in your vehicle," the dispatcher told her. "A rehabilitator is coming." "How long?" 40 minutes, maybe more." Evelyn looked toward the bridge. "She's wet through." "Please don't approach her." Evelyn promised she would not. She kept the promise for almost 12 minutes. The sleet thickened, turning white in the headlights. Water crept higher along the creek bank. Evelyn found an old wool lap blanket behind the truck seat, the faded blue one Daniel had used on cold mornings while waiting for trail crews. She did not carry it beneath the bridge. Instead, she moved downwind, laid it over low brush several feet from the Bobcat, and used a fallen branch to create a small barrier against the weather. The animal tracked every motion. Evelyn never faced her directly. She kept her shoulders turned and her gaze lowered, the same posture she once used with hospital patients who woke disoriented and ready to fight anyone nearby. "You don't have to like me," she murmured. "Just save your strength." The Bobcat's whiskers twitched. A gust pushed sleet beneath the bridge. Evelyn stepped back, slipped in the mud, and caught herself on one knee. Her grocery sack tipped from the truck's open door. A soup can rolled beneath the bumper, while the rye loaf landed upright in the road, still balanced on its flattened end. For one strange second, Evelyn stared at it. Daniel would have called that loaf the most disciplined thing in Lane County. The thought brought a brief laugh out of her, surprising and rusty. Beneath the bridge, one of the Bobcat's ears lifted at the sound, before flattening again. Headlights appeared through the trees 20 minutes later. The sanctuary truck stopped behind Evelyn's pickup, and a lean man in an orange rain shell stepped out carrying a crate, a catch pole, and a canvas medical bag. Nolan Reyes was 46 then, with dark hair graying at the temples and the calm movements of someone accustomed to animals that judged hesitation quickly. "You, Evelyn Mercer?" "Yes, mostly." He looked at the blue blanket, then at the mud on her knee. "Mostly" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She was losing heat. Nolan did not argue. He crouched near the bridge entrance and studied the bobcat for nearly a minute. "Female," he said. "Young adult. Wires around the leg, but I can't tell how tight. She's been here a while." The bobcat made a low, coughing growl when he shifted closer. There was life in that sound, and Evelyn felt a flicker of relief. Nolan asked her to stand near the road and keep the flashlight aimed at the ground, not the animal's face. He approached with a heavy towel over one arm. Every movement was slow. He spoke in a low stream of ordinary words, because rhythm was sometimes less frightening than silence. The rescue took nearly half an hour. The wire had caught around roots beneath the mud. Nolan freed it inch by inch, while the bobcat twisted once beneath the towel, then went still from exhaustion. Evelyn held the flashlight until her hand cramped. When the beam wandered, Nolan said, "Lower left," and she corrected it without answering. At last, he lifted the bundled animal into the crate. One spotted forepaw slipped briefly from beneath the towel. It curled inward toward her chest before disappearing again. Evelyn noticed the notch in the left ear and a pale line above the right eye. She also noticed 3 juniper twigs tangled in the fur along the bobcat's side, green even in the gray sleet. Nolan latched the crate. The bobcat opened her eyes and fixed them on Evelyn through the crate holes. She did not blink. "Will she live?" Evelyn asked. Nolan looked toward the rising creek, then back at the crate. "She made it through tonight," he said. "For now, that's the answer." Evelyn followed the sanctuary truck through the storm, the chipped green mug rolling softly in her empty cup holder, and the rescued bobcat riding ahead in the dark. The sanctuary clinic stood at the end of a gravel road lined with dripping sword ferns, its windows glowing pale yellow through the storm. By the time Nolan backed the truck beneath the covered intake bay, sleet had turned to heavy rain, and Evelyn's hands had begun to ache from gripping the steering wheel. She parked beside the feed shed and remained in her truck while Nolan carried the crate inside. The promise she had made on the phone still mattered. She had helped locate the animal. She had held the light. Now, trained hands had to take over. Through the clinic window, Evelyn saw 2 figures move around the examination table. Nolan was joined by Dr. Lydia Chen, a wildlife veterinarian with cropped black hair and bright yellow clogs that squeaked whenever she crossed the wet floor. They worked beneath a cone of white light while the bobcat remained covered by the heavy towel. Evelyn tried not to watch too closely. She had stood beside enough hospital beds to recognize urgency in the way people moved. Nolan reached for warm fluids. Lydia checked the injured leg. A technician adjusted the oxygen line, then wrote something on a clipboard with quick, sharp strokes. The bobcat was sedated before they removed the rusted wire. Evelyn sat in the waiting room with her coat dripping onto the tiles. An old electric heater clicked beside a rack of wildlife brochures, blowing air that smelled faintly of dust and wet wool. Someone had left a ceramic dish of peppermints on the reception desk. Evelyn took one, unwrapped it, and held it for several minutes without remembering to eat it. Near midnight, Nolan came through the swinging door. "The leg isn't broken," he said. Evelyn's shoulders lowered. "There's swelling and strain. She's dehydrated, underweight, and colder than she should be, but we got the wire off cleanly. No major damage that we can see. Can she be released?" "Not tonight." "I meant eventually." Nolan studied her for a moment. "That depends on her." It was an answer Evelyn respected. He offered to call when there was news. Evelyn thanked him, placed the forgotten peppermint in her pocket, and drove home through rain that shone silver in her headlights. At 5:20, she woke before the alarm she no longer needed. She made tea in the chipped green mug, opened the back door, and listened to water dripping from the eaves. A line of cloud rested low over the ridge. "Rain all day," she said softly. Daniel's old forecast had finally become an easy one. At 8, the sanctuary called. The bobcat had survived the night. Evelyn returned that afternoon with the blue blanket washed and folded inside a paper bag. She also brought a tin of oatmeal cookies for the staff, though Nolan examined them with theatrical suspicion. "Are these a bribe?" "They're overbaked." "That doesn't answer the question." "They're too hard to be effective bribery." Nolan bit one, considered it, and dipped the rest into his coffee. "They have structural integrity." The bobcat was housed in a quiet recovery enclosure behind the clinic. One wall contained a narrow observation window covered by a dark curtain. The floor was layered with straw and cedar chips. A wooden shelter stood in the far corner, beside a thick branch fixed low enough for an injured animal to climb without jumping. Evelyn looked through the glass for only a few seconds. The bobcat crouched inside the shelter, eyes reflecting faintly from the darkness. Her ears pressed back when Nolan shifted the curtain. A guttural warning rolled from her chest. "That's encouraging," Nolan said as he closed the curtain. Evelyn looked at him. "Angry takes energy." For the first week, she visited every morning but never entered the enclosure. She helped wash feeding trays, folded towels, and recorded weights, while Nolan or Lydia handled medical care. The bobcat struck at the transport divider whenever anyone came too close. She refused food while people watched and waited until the building was silent before drinking. Evelyn learned to recognize the faint scrape of the animal pulling a meal into the shelter. She also learned that the bobcat disliked the sound of Lydia's yellow clogs. Whenever they squeaked in the corridor, the spotted ears appeared at the shelter opening, flattened in deep suspicion. Lydia tried walking in socks once, only to step into a puddle from a leaking water pan. The bobcat watched the entire incident. "I think she enjoyed that," Lydia said. "She looked attentive," Evelyn replied. By the second week, the animal began grooming again. She licked her forelegs with quick, rough strokes and used one paw to wash around the pale mark above her right eye. She always cleaned the uninjured side first. Afterward, she curled her right forepaw inward beneath her chest and listened to the building settle. Nolan noticed Evelyn watching through the observation glass. "You see patterns," he said. "It was useful in nursing. It's useful here too, as long as we don't turn patterns into wishes." Evelyn understood the warning. A bobcat eating in her presence would not mean affection. Remaining visible would not mean gratitude. Recovery was not a promise of relationship. Still, she wanted to help. Nolan allowed her to begin delivering meals through the outer access hatch. She wore the same brown boots each time and approached along the same path. Before opening the hatch, she tapped twice on the wooden frame so the sound would not surprise the animal. At first, the bobcat rushed deeper into the shelter. Evelyn set down the tray and left. The next morning, she repeated the 2 taps. The morning after that, she did the same. Some days the bobcat growled. Some days she remained completely silent. Once, Evelyn accidentally dropped the metal latch, and the sudden clang made them both jump. Evelyn placed a hand over her heart. "Well," she murmured, "at least neither of us pretended to be brave." From the shelter came a short, breathy huff. Nolan, standing beyond the doorway, hid a smile behind his clipboard. Gradually, the animal stopped striking at the divider when Evelyn's boots crossed the corridor. She still watched with hard, unwavering eyes. She still kept the shelter between them. but her breathing no longer quickened at the sound of the two taps. Evelyn began reading during the longer observation periods. She chose an old mystery novel from the library and sat behind the covered window, speaking only when Nolan asked for notes. The pages made a soft whisper as she turned them. One afternoon, she found the bobcat resting outside the shelter. The animal's body remained tense, ready to retreat. Her injured leg was stretched along the straw, and her amber gaze followed Evelyn's smallest movement. Yet she did not hide. Evelyn sat down without looking directly at her. For nearly 20 minutes, neither moved. Then the bobcat lowered her chin onto her paws. It was not trust, but fear had made room for rest, and Evelyn knew enough about healing to understand how much that cost. By the third week, the storm had moved east, leaving the sanctuary beneath a hard blue sky and a cold that sharpened every sound. Frost silvered the gravel outside the clinic. The cedar branches clicked together when the wind passed through them, and the water pans formed thin skins of ice between morning checks. Evelyn arrived before 8 each day, wearing the same brown boots, the same gray wool coat, and Daniel's old knitted cap pulled low over her ears. She carried the faded blue blanket folded over one arm. The blanket had been washed twice since the night beneath the bridge, but it still held a faint scent of lanolin and wood smoke. A small tear near one corner had been mended with crooked white stitches Daniel once claimed gave it character. Evelyn had almost left it at home. Personal objects did not belong in wildlife enclosures merely because they comforted the person offering them. Nolan examined the blanket, then checked the care chart. "She stopped chewing bedding," he said, "and she's choosing the open platform more often. We could place it beneath the heat lamp provided there aren't any loose threads." Evelyn turned the repaired corner toward him. Nolan rubbed the stitches between his fingers. "Who did this?" "Daniel. He was not a seamstress. He was confident, though. That explains the knots." Evelyn smiled and clipped 2 long threads with a pair of medical scissors. They waited until the bobcat had moved behind the divider. Nolan entered the recovery side and spread the blanket across a low wooden platform, tucking every edge securely beneath it. Evelyn remained outside. Even after weeks of helping, she never assumed that familiarity made her presence harmless. When the divider opened, the bobcat did not come forward. She stayed inside her shelter, nose lifted, testing the changed air. Her ears swiveled toward the platform. One paw appeared at the entrance, then withdrew. For several minutes, only her whiskers were visible. Lydia passed through the corridor in her yellow clogs. The first squeak made the bobcat's ears flatten. The second made her pull her head back. Lydia stopped and looked down at her shoes. "I'm beginning to take this personally." "She has standards," Evelyn said. "Against footwear? Against unnecessary noise." Lydia removed the clogs and carried them under one arm, walking away in purple socks, patterned with tiny stethoscopes. The bobcat watched until she disappeared. Evelyn sat behind the observation window with the curtain open only a hand's width. She held the chipped green mug between her palms, though the tea inside had already cooled. The clinic smelled of cedar bedding, thawing earth, and the fish Nolan had prepared for the morning meal. The bobcat emerged after nearly 20 minutes. She moved low, placing each paw with care. Her injured hind leg still shortened 1 step, but the stiffness had eased. She circled the platform without touching it, pausing to sniff the corners. Then she rubbed one cheek lightly against the wooden edge, leaving her scent without surrendering any caution. "She's claiming the platform," Nolan whispered from the doorway. "Not the blanket? She hasn't decided whether the blanket has offended her." The bobcat stepped onto it with one front paw. She froze. The wool shifted beneath her pads. Her paw lifted immediately, and she stared at the blanket as if it had broken an agreement. Evelyn pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. The animal extended the paw again, touched the cloth, and pulled it back once more. On the third attempt, she placed both forepaws on the platform. Then, with a sudden backward hump, she retreated into the shelter. Nolan wrote something on the chart. "What are you recording?" Evelyn asked. "Patient evaluated blanket." And blanket remains under review. The exchange warmed a place in Evelyn that had been cold for months. She could almost hear Daniel offering his own opinion about a wildcat inspecting his sewing. He would have declared the blanket structurally sound and the bobcat unreasonably demanding. The thought did not wound as sharply as it once had. That afternoon, the bobcat finally climbed onto the platform. She did not lie down. She stood over the blue wool, nose moving rapidly, then pawed at it twice. The motion exposed one crooked white stitch. She sniffed it, sneezed, and looked offended by the entire arrangement. Evelyn turned her face toward the wall, so the small laugh would not feel directed at her. When she looked back, the bobcat had settled. Her body remained compact, feet beneath her, head upright. The faded blue showed around her spotted coat like a patch of winter sky. Her right forepaw curled inward under her chest. One ear remained aimed toward the hall, while the other tracked the rustle of Evelyn's coat. They stayed that way for nearly an hour. Evelyn read several pages of her mystery novel, though she retained none of them. Every so often, she glanced over the top of the book and found the animal watching her. At closing time, Nolan dimmed the corridor lights. "You can leave the book here," he said. "She won't solve it before morning. She may do better than I have." Evelyn marked the page with the peppermint wrapper she had carried since the rescue night. She stood slowly, feeling stiffness in her knees, and reached for her mug. The bobcat's head lifted. Evelyn stopped. The animal did not retreat. Her amber eyes rested on Evelyn's face, unblinking and bright beneath the heat lamp. The pale line above her right eye had become clearer as the fur dried and filled out. A small scar, Lydia believed. Old enough that no one could know its story. Evelyn lowered herself back into the chair. "It's all right," she murmured. "I can stay another minute." The bobcat's ear turned toward her voice. Evelyn placed both hands around the mug and looked slightly aside. Direct staring carried a challenge in the wild. She had learned to soften her gaze, to let her eyelids lower briefly, then open without expectation. She did it once. The bobcat remained still. Evelyn waited. The heater clicked off. Somewhere in the feed room, Nolan dropped a scoop and muttered under his breath. Outside, meltwater fell from the roof in a slow, hollow rhythm. Then the bobcat's eyelids lowered. Not the quick reflex of sleep, not a startled flinch. They closed with deliberate slowness and opened again. Evelyn did not move. Her chest tightened around a feeling too tender to name. In hospital rooms, she had watched patients relax when they finally recognized a familiar voice. She had seen frightened hands unclench beneath a warm blanket. This was smaller than those moments and no less profound. The bobcat had not come closer. She had not asked to be touched. She had simply allowed herself to stop watching for danger for the length of one breath. Nolan appeared quietly beside the window. He had seen it too. "She needs a chart name," he said after a while. Evelyn looked at the green sprigs still dried inside a jar on the shelf, saved from the branches tangled in the bobcat's coat on rescue night. "Juniper," she said. Nolan wrote it carefully. On the blue blanket, Juniper lowered her chin to her paws. Her eyes remained open, but no longer hard. Evelyn sat with her until the last daylight faded from the clinic floor. By early December, Juniper's recovery had settled into a rhythm so quiet that no one noticed at first how much the clinic had begun arranging itself around her. Evelyn arrived at 7:45 each morning, usually before Nolan finished his first coffee. She parked beside the feed shed, brushed frost from the shoulders of her gray coat, and carried the chipped green mug in one hand and a canvas lunch bag in the other. The sanctuary grounds smelled of frozen earth, cedar shavings, and the faint mineral dampness of Salmon Creek below the ridge. Before entering the recovery corridor, she tapped twice on the wooden frame. Juniper no longer fled at the sound. Sometimes one spotted ear appeared above the edge of the platform. Sometimes her eyes opened from the blue blanket and followed Evelyn's boots. On colder mornings, she remained curled tightly beneath the heat lamp with her short tail tucked against her body, pretending that the human beyond the wire was not worth waking for. Evelyn respected the performance. "Good morning," she would say without expecting an answer. Then she set down the feeding tray, checked the water level, and stepped away. Juniper had recovered enough strength to make her preferences clear. Rabbit was accepted immediately. Quail required inspection. Fish was carried to the farthest corner of the enclosure before being eaten, as though secrecy improved the flavor. She refused anything placed too close to the red plastic water pan, though she drank from the same pan once the food had been removed. Nolan replaced it with a gray one. Juniper drank without hesitation. "I suppose the color was the problem," he said. Evelyn studied the abandoned red pan. Perhaps she thought it was shouting. Nolan used it afterward for soaking cleaning brushes. Juniper watched the demotion with what Evelyn privately considered satisfaction. Her daily work at the sanctuary remained small and practical. She folded towels, filled observation forms, sterilized feeding tools, and repaired loose seams in the heavy gloves used for animal transfers. She did not touch Juniper. She did not enter the enclosure while the bobcat was awake and free on the recovery side. Care came through routines, not closeness. At noon, Evelyn usually ate soup in the staff room beside Lydia, who continued wearing the yellow clogs despite Juniper's opinion of them. Lydia had learned to glide rather than stride, reducing the squeak to an occasional chirp. The first time she crossed the corridor silently, Juniper looked toward her feet, then toward her face, as if suspecting deception. "She preferred me honest," Lydia said. "She preferred you predictable," Evelyn corrected. "That is less flattering." Their conversation stayed light, but Evelyn understood what lay beneath them. Everyone at the sanctuary had seen volunteers become attached to wild animals for the wrong reasons. Some mistook tolerance for affection. Others wanted proof that their kindness had been recognized. Juniper offered none. She permitted Evelyn's presence because Evelyn had become part of the environment. 2 taps, brown boots, paper pages turning, the faint scent of tea. That was enough. In the afternoons, Evelyn sat behind the observation window with her mystery novel. Juniper often moved to the low branch fixed across the enclosure and balanced there with her injured hind leg, held slightly higher than the other. Her muscles strengthened with each cautious climb. She used the branch to sharpen her claws, dragging each forepaw down the bark with slow concentration. Once, a strip of bark landed in her water. Juniper stared at it for nearly a minute, then looked toward Evelyn. Evelyn kept her face solemn. Poor planning. Juniper hooked the bark out with one paw and dropped it on the floor. The next day, Nolan found 3 more pieces arranged beside the pan. "She's cleaning up after herself," Evelyn said. "She's making a point. No one likes criticism from management." Nolan left a smaller branch near the platform, and Juniper ignored it completely. Warmth entered Evelyn's days through moments like those, never grand enough to announce themselves. She began baking again, though she still overcooked the first tray of nearly everything. She brought molasses cookies for the staff and left the hardest ones in a separate tin labeled for dunking. Lydia added a second label beneath it, or construction. At home, Evelyn's evenings no longer stretched without shape. She washed her mug, packed her lunch, and placed Daniel's cap near the back door. She reviewed Juniper's notes while eating dinner at the kitchen table. Weight improving, swelling reduced, appetite normal, stress response decreasing. The language was clinical, but the life behind it was not. On nights when wind moved through the firs, Evelyn wondered what Juniper remembered of the forest. Did she dream in scent and motion? Did she hear mice beneath the clinic walls? Did confinement feel safer now that hunger and pain had eased, or merely more tolerable? Evelyn knew safety could become its own kind of cage if kept too long. She had seen it in herself after Damel's death. The house had protected her from awkward sympathy, from invitations she did not know how to accept, from the risk of feeling joy and losing it again. Her routines had been orderly. They had also been narrow. Juniper did not allow narrowness to look like peace. The bobcat began spending more time near the outer end of the enclosure, where cold air slipped beneath the door and carried the smells of fir needles, damp soil, and distant animals. She sat there with her nose lifted, whiskers forward, body still except for the quick movements of her ears. When a squirrel ran across the clinic roof, Juniper dropped low so quickly that Evelyn lost sight of her. A second later, she reappeared on the branch, eyes fixed upward, every line of her body sharpened by instinct. The limp remained, but the hunter had returned. Nolan began placing food in different locations to encourage movement. He hid small portions beneath bark, behind logs, or inside shallow bundles of straw. Juniper searched silently, pausing often to listen. She found each meal faster than expected. One morning, she discovered the food in a hanging feeder and struck it too hard. The container swung back and bumped her shoulder. Juniper leaped sideways, landed with perfect dignity, and spent the next 5 minutes pretending the feeder did not exist. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the observation sheet until her smile had passed. Later, she wrote, "Strong response to moving enrichment. No hesitation afterward." She did not write that Juniper had looked embarrassed. By the end of the month, Evelyn knew the sounds of the clinic as well as she once knew the hospital ward. She recognized the refrigerator's low hum, the scrape of Nolan's chair, the rattle of the outer latch, and the exact silence that meant Juniper was awake and listening. The sanctuary did not need Evelyn in the way her patients once had. That difference slowly became a comfort. She could offer care without being the center of it. She could matter without being necessary. She could sit beside another living creature's recovery and understand that the best outcome would carry that creature away from her. Each evening, before leaving, Evelyn closed her book and waited. Juniper usually remained on the branch or blue blanket, watchful and composed. Sometimes she gave no sign that Evelyn's departure registered at all. But once Evelyn reached the corridor door, Juniper's ears always turned toward the fading sound of her brown boots. For the time being, that small acknowledgement was enough for both of them. Spring arrived slowly in the Cascade foothills, not as a clean change of season, but as a series of small permissions. First, the ice disappeared from the water pans before noon. Then, moss brightened along the shaded stones, and tiny green points pushed through the mud beside the clinic wall. By March, the rain had softened. It no longer struck the roof with winter's hard insistence. It whispered through the firs instead, carrying the smell of thawing earth and alder buds into the recovery corridor. Juniper noticed every change before the humans did. She began waking earlier, often before Evelyn arrived. When the two familiar taps sounded against the wooden frame, Juniper was already sitting near the screened outer section, her nose lifted toward the cold morning air. Her coat had grown fuller and cleaner, rich with tawny brown and dark spots. The hollow look around her shoulders had disappeared. Only the slight pause in her right hind step remained. Her wildness had not diminished with health. It had sharpened. She no longer tolerated staff movement with tired resignation. She watched doors, tracked birds across the roof, and flattened low whenever a squirrel crossed the overhead branches. She scent-marked the enclosure logs with her cheeks and scratched the bark until pale strips curled onto the floor. At night, the trail camera sometimes caught her moving in perfect silence from platform to branch, restless beneath moonlight. Evelyn found those signs reassuring, even when they carried an ache. One morning, Juniper overturned the gray water pan while stalking a moth. The moth escaped. The pan rolled beneath the platform. Juniper stared at the spreading water, then climbed onto the branch and appeared to remove herself entirely from responsibility. Nolan found the evidence during rounds. "Any witnesses?" he asked. Evelyn looked toward Juniper, who was grooming one shoulder with grave concentration. None willing to cooperate. Lydia arrived with a mop and pointed one yellow clog toward the branch. She has the expression of someone who has already contacted legal counsel. Juniper paused mid-lick, one ear turned toward them. Evelyn bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing too loudly. The clinic had begun to feel warmer, in ways that had little to do with weather. Mara, Evelyn's 16-year-old granddaughter, started volunteering on Saturdays. She was Daniel and Evelyn's daughter Claire's only child, quiet in unfamiliar places, and more comfortable with sketchbooks than conversation. Mara never crowded the observation window. She sat beside Evelyn and drew the curve of Juniper's back, the angle of her ears, and the inward curl of her forepaw. She drew quickly, never trying to make the bobcat prettier than she was. Juniper disliked the scratching sound of charcoal at first. She watched the pencil with narrowed eyes and retreated whenever Mara turned a page. On the third Saturday, Mara switched to a softer graphite stick. Juniper remained on the branch. "She approves of your equipment," Evelyn whispered. Mara studied the bobcat. "I think she just dislikes squeaky things." Then she and Lydia have something in common. From the corridor came the unmistakable chirp of a yellow clog. Juniper's ears flattened. Mara covered her mouth to hide a smile. Those small moments entered Evelyn's life carefully, as if joy itself understood that sudden movements might frighten her away. At home, she began leaving the kitchen curtains open after dusk. She accepted Beth's invitation to a library supper and stayed long enough for dessert. She even allowed Walter Kim to repair the loose board on her back step, though he spent 40 minutes explaining that Daniel's original nails had been optimistic. Evelyn made tea for them both. It went cold while they talked. She did not mind. At the sanctuary, Nolan gradually expanded Juniper's access to the larger outdoor rehabilitation pen. The new space was enclosed, but thick with natural cover. Sword ferns, mossy logs, a young cedar, and a rock ledge warmed by afternoon sun. A double barrier kept staff safely outside while allowing Juniper to experience wind, rain, birdsong, and the layered scents of the forest. For 2 days, she refused to enter. She stood at the connecting gate, stretched her neck forward, and tested the air. Then she backed away and sat on the blue blanket as though the entire addition had been built without consulting her. On the third morning, a varied thrush landed beyond the mesh and gave a sharp ringing call. Juniper crossed the gate in 3 silent steps. Within minutes, she had inspected every corner. She rubbed against the cedar trunk, climbed halfway up a slanted log, and crouched beneath a fern where only the tips of her ears remained visible. When Nolan placed a fresh straw bundle near the rock ledge, Juniper dragged it 6 feet away and rebuilt it beneath the log. "She has revised the floor plan," Evelyn said. "She found ours unimaginative," Nolan replied. By April, Juniper spent most daylight hours outdoors. The afternoon of the quiet breakthrough was unusually warm. Sunlight filtered through the cedar branches and lay in gold patches across the rehabilitation yard. The air smelled of damp soil and crushed fern. Somewhere down the slope, Salmon Creek moved loudly with snowmelt. Evelyn sat outside the outer barrier on a low wooden stool, reading without turning many pages. Juniper rested beneath the slanted log. For nearly an hour, The bobcat remained hidden, except for one paw and the faint rise of her breathing. Evelyn did not call to her. She had learned that silence was not emptiness. It was often the space in which a wild creature made its most honest decisions. A breeze shifted. Juniper emerged. She crossed the enclosure without haste, stepping through sunlight and shadow. Her injured leg moved almost evenly now. She stopped beside the cedar, scratched once at the bark, then looked toward Evelyn. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the book. Juniper came closer to the barrier. Not near enough to touch, never that. She settled on the other side of the mesh, several feet from Evelyn's stool, where a thin line of sunlight passed through the wire. Her body remained angled toward the forest. Her ears continued turning toward every distant sound. But she folded her legs beneath her and curled the right forepaw inward. Evelyn stayed perfectly still. The sun shifted slowly across the ground until Juniper's shadow reached the fence. On Evelyn's side, the edge of her own shadow stretched toward it. For one brief moment, the two shapes touched. Mara stood near the clinic door with her sketchbook against her chest. Nolan had paused beside the feed shed. Neither approached. Juniper lowered her chin. Evelyn felt something inside her loosen, not because the bobcat had chosen her over the forest, but because she had not been required to. Juniper could listen toward the trees and still rest near the woman whose footsteps she knew. Love, Evelyn was beginning to understand, did not always ask to be first. Sometimes it was simply the place beside which fear became quiet. A bee wandered between them and bumped twice against the mesh. Juniper's eyes followed it with such serious concentration that Mara's shoulders shook with silent laughter. When the bee escaped upward, Juniper looked briefly annoyed, then resumed her stillness. Evelyn turned one page. The paper whispered. Juniper's eyelids lowered halfway, then opened again. They remained beside each other until the sunlight left the fence, and their shadows separated naturally across the grass. By late April, Juniper had stopped looking like an animal recovering from winter. She looked like an animal preparing to leave. The difference was subtle at first. Evelyn noticed it in the way Juniper began pacing the eastern fence just before dawn, not frantically, but with purpose. She moved from cedar trunk to rock ledge, paused to test the wind, then retraced the same line with her nose low to the ground. Her ears stayed angled toward the ridge beyond the sanctuary, where the forest rose in dark folds above Salmon Creek. The trail camera recorded her doing it for hours. Nolan reviewed the footage one morning while Evelyn stood beside him with her mug cooling between both hands. "She's mapping the boundary," he said, "looking for a way out, remembering there's a world outside." Evelyn watched Juniper pause on the monitor, lift her face, and breathe through parted lips. Even in the grainy black and white image, there was nothing uncertain in her posture. The bobcat knew where she belonged. That knowledge should have brought only relief. Instead, Evelyn felt the first quiet pull of grief. She had understood from the beginning that recovery led toward release. She had repeated it to herself each time Juniper ate, climbed, hunted, or trusted the strength in her hind leg. Still, understanding an ending in theory was different from hearing it approach in the scrape of claws against bark. The sanctuary began formal release assessments. Lydia checked Juniper's gait while observing from outside the pen. Nolan changed the feeding routine so meals required longer searches and quicker movement. Live prey was not used in the rehabilitation yard, but scent trails, concealed food, and moving enrichment tested Juniper's hunting responses without encouraging dependence on people. Juniper excelled at nearly everything. She tracked hidden scent through wet fern, climbed the slanted log without favoring her injured side, and struck a swinging lure with both forepaws before it completed a second arc. When a red-tailed hawk passed overhead, she vanished beneath cover so quickly that Mara lost sight of her through the observation window. "That was fast," Mara whispered. That was right, Nolan said. Juniper reappeared only after the hawk had gone. The one concern was her tolerance of Evelyn, not affection. Nolan was careful with the word. Juniper did not solicit contact, approach the barrier for food, or remain visible when unfamiliar people entered the yard. She still avoided Lydia's yellow clogs and disappeared whenever the maintenance cart rattled past. Yet Evelyn's 2 taps no longer triggered withdrawal. Juniper sometimes rested while Evelyn sat nearby. Once, she even continued grooming after Evelyn shifted her chair. For a recovering animal, that calm had been useful. For a release candidate, it had to be examined. We need to know whether she's comfortable with you, Nolan said, or comfortable with humans. Evelyn nodded. The distinction mattered more than her feelings. For the next several days, she stayed away from the sanctuary. It was Nolan's suggestion, though he presented it gently. Staff members changed their coats, altered feeding times, and reduced all non-essential noise around the rehabilitation pen. Evelyn was asked not to call, tap, or visit until they had observed whether Juniper's behavior changed in her absence. At home, Evelyn discovered how much of her week had become tied to the sanctuary. She woke at 5:20 and still packed lunch before remembering there was nowhere to take it. She poured tea into the chipped mug, opened the back door, and found the morning unnaturally empty without the thought of Juniper waiting beneath the cedar. Rain had returned overnight. It clung to the orchard grass and ticked softly from the gutters. Walter's wheelbarrow stood upside down beside the fence, collecting a silver line of water along its rim. Evelyn decided to clean the pantry. Within an hour, every jar had been arranged by height, label direction, and expiration date. She found 3 tins of nutmeg, 2 unopened bags of lentils, and a packet of soup Daniel had bought more than a decade earlier. She held the packet for a long time. Then she threw it away. The act felt both ridiculous and enormous. At noon, Mara came by with 2 grilled cheese sandwiches wrapped in foil. She found Evelyn standing on a chair, reorganizing the upper shelf for the second time. Mom said you might be overcleaning. Your mother exaggerates. Mara looked at the labels facing forward in perfect rows. You alphabetized the spices. They were unruly. They ate at the kitchen table while rain blurred the window. Mara had brought her sketchbook. Between bites, she showed Evelyn a drawing of Juniper crouched beneath a fern, only the eyes and notched ear visible. You made her look ready, Evelyn said. She is ready. The certainty in Mara's voice was not cruel. It was young and honest. Evelyn touched the edge of the paper. Yes. Mara hesitated. Does that make you sad? It makes me both things. What things? Proud and sad. Mara considered this, then nodded, as if the answer belonged naturally beside the rain. The warmth of her visit lasted after she left. 1 sandwich crumb remained near the sugar bowl, and Evelyn did not wipe it away until evening. On the 4th day, Nolan called. Juniper's response to unfamiliar staff had sharpened. She stayed hidden longer, avoided the feeding gate, and resumed pacing only after the grounds fell silent. She had not become careless around people. Evelyn felt relief, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. There's one more thing, Nolan said. She's searching for your sound. Evelyn sat down. What do you mean? She goes to the inner gate around 8. Listens. The image entered Evelyn's mind too clearly. Juniper beside the wooden frame, waiting for 2 taps that did not come. That doesn't mean she should stay, Evelyn said. No. It doesn't mean she misses me. No. Nolan's voice softened. But it means routine mattered. Evelyn looked at Daniel's cap, hanging beside the back door. Routine had mattered to her too. She returned to the sanctuary the following morning, but did not resume the old pattern. Nolan asked her to enter through the rear corridor without tapping. She stood behind the observation screen while Juniper rested on the rock ledge. At first, the Bobcat did not know she was there. Then the wind shifted through the open vent. Juniper's head lifted. Her nose moved once. She turned toward the screen and stared directly at the narrow, dark opening. Her body did not relax. She did not come closer. After several seconds, she rose and walked to the far end of the enclosure, where she sat facing the forest. Evelyn understood. Juniper had recognized her, and recognition had not changed the direction of her longing. Later that afternoon, Nolan found fresh claw marks along the highest cedar trunk and deep impressions where Juniper had launched toward the overhead mesh after a passing squirrel. Her strength had returned beyond doubt. Lydia completed the medical clearance. Nolan scheduled the release for early May, near a protected drainage above Salmon Creek, several miles from roads and houses. When he told Evelyn, Juniper was pacing the eastern fence again. The evening wind carried pine resin, damp stone, and the distant rush of snowmelt. Evelyn placed one hand around the crack in her mug. "How many days?" she asked. 6. Juniper stopped beneath the cedar and listened toward the ridge. 6 days, Evelyn thought. Then the door would open, and everything they had done right would require her to let Juniper disappear. Release morning arrived under a sky the color of unpolished steel. At 5:30, mist lay low along the sanctuary road, and every fern beside the gravel carried beads of water. Evelyn reached the clinic before Nolan, though she had barely slept. She wore Daniel's knitted cap, her gray coat, and the brown boots Juniper knew. The chipped green mug sat untouched in the truck. Inside, the clinic was quieter than usual. Lydia had changed out of her squeaking yellow clogs. Mara stood near the supply cabinet with her sketchbook closed against her chest. Juniper waited in the transfer enclosure. She had been moved there before dawn through a series of gates without direct handling. The transport crate stood open inside the narrow pen, lined with straw and covered on 3 sides. Juniper paced once along the mesh, then stopped with her body angled away from the people beyond it. Her eyes were bright. Her right forepaw curled inward whenever she paused. Nolan checked the small tracking collar one final time. It was lightweight, fitted with a timed release, and designed to fall away after several months. Juniper had tolerated it poorly, pawing at the strap and rolling one shoulder as if trying to shed a branch. By release morning, she had stopped reacting, though Evelyn suspected she had not forgiven anyone. "Signal is clean," Nolan said. Lydia looked at the monitor. "Battery is strong." Evelyn nodded because her voice had become unreliable. The crate door remained open for nearly 40 minutes before Juniper entered. No one pushed her. Nolan had placed a scent trail and part of her morning meal inside, then stepped away. Juniper circled the entrance twice. She sniffed the threshold, struck once at a loose piece of straw, and looked toward Evelyn's side of the room. The dark screen hid most of Evelyn's face, but not the outline of her coat or the shape of her hands. This was not the time to call Juniper toward anything. At last, the Bobcat stepped inside. The outer gate closed behind her with a padded thud. Mara exhaled so softly it sounded like a page turning. The drive to the release site took nearly an hour. Nolan drove the sanctuary truck, while Lydia sat beside him with the receiver. Evelyn and Mara followed in the pickup, climbing beyond the last houses into the higher drainage above Salmon Creek. Clouds moved heavily across the ridge. The forecast had promised light rain by evening, but the wind already carried the metallic smell of a larger storm. Evelyn lowered the window and heard branches rubbing high above them. Mara held the blue blanket folded on her knees. It would not go into the forest with Juniper. Nolan had explained that familiar human scent could draw her back toward roads or buildings. The blanket was there because Mara thought Evelyn might need it. "You can keep it," Mara said. "It was always mine." Evelyn glanced at her. Mara looked out the window. After she's gone, Evelyn placed one hand over the blanket. Yes. The release site was a wooded basin bordered by basalt and a creek swollen with spring runoff. Ferns crowded the ground beneath huckleberry and vine maple. Farther uphill, an old burn opened into young pine, offering cover, prey, and miles of protected country. Nolan parked beneath a leaning fir and waited before anyone moved. The crate remained covered. Juniper made no sound inside. Wind passed through the basin in long, cold breaths. A varied thrush called beyond the creek. Mara tucked both hands beneath her sleeves. Nolan and Lydia carried the crate 30 yards from the road and set it facing a narrow game trail. Evelyn followed only as far as the marked boundary. She sat on a moss-dark log with the blue blanket beside her. Nolan attached a cord to the crate door and backed away. "Whenever she chooses," he said. He pulled. The door lifted. Nothing happened. For several minutes the crate seemed empty except for darkness. Rain began as a soft patter against the plastic roof. Then Juniper's nose appeared. She tested the air. One ear followed, then the notched left ear. Her body remained hidden while her whiskers moved rapidly. The forest gave her countless messages at once: water, bark, vole trails, wet stone, distant deer, and the territories of animals no human could detect. Juniper stepped out. She crouched low beside the crate, every muscle held close. The tracking collar looked briefly strange against her neck, too orderly for the mottled wildness of her coat. She looked toward the creek, then toward the rocks. Finally, she turned toward the people. Her gaze passed over Nolan and Lydia, found Mara near the truck, then settled on Evelyn. The distance between them was greater than it had ever been at the sanctuary. For one suspended moment, rain touched the leaves, the creek moved over stones, and Juniper stood with one forepaw lifted. Her eyelids lowered once, slowly. Evelyn pressed her lips together. Juniper turned and moved up the game trail. She did not run. She slipped between ferns, paused beneath a young pine, and listened. Her short tail flicked once. Then the forest broke her shape into shadow, bark, and wet leaves. The tracking receiver marked her steady movement uphill. By noon, she had crossed the creek. By dusk, she had reached the far side of the basin. That night, the storm arrived early. Rain hammered Evelyn's roof hard enough to wake her. Wind drove branches against the kitchen window, and the power failed after midnight. She lit Daniel's old lantern and placed it beside the chipped green mug. Nolan called at 6. Juniper's signal had stopped moving near a steep ravine. "It may be shelter," he said. "The terrain can distort the reading." Evelyn held the phone with both hands. "And if it isn't, we check when the road is safe." For 2 days, landslides blocked the upper route. The receiver caught fragments of signal, then lost them. Once, Nolan detected a faint pulse farther east, but it vanished before he could fix a direction. On the third morning, the storm cleared. Nolan reached the ravine with a ranger and found no collar, no tracks clear enough to follow, and no sign of Juniper. The receiver remained silent. At home, Evelyn sat beside the cold lantern with the blue blanket across her knees. For the first time since the footbridge, she could not tell herself that Juniper had made it through the night. For the first week after the storm, Evelyn woke before dawn and reached for the phone before her eyes had fully opened. Each morning brought the same kind of message. No confirmed signal. No clear track. Nolan never softened the facts, but he delivered them gently. The ravine had shed mud and stones across the game trail. Floodwater had flattened the ferns and erased prints along the creek. In several places, the receiver caught brief static that might have been a weak transmission or interference from the steep basalt walls. "We're still checking," he told her. Evelyn thanked him every time. Then she carried the chipped green mug to the kitchen table and let the tea go cold. She joined the searches whenever Nolan believed her presence would not complicate the work. At 62, she was still strong enough for long forest walks, though the wet slopes tested her knees. She wore Daniel's old rain shell over her gray coat and carried a whistle, water, and a folded topographic map inside a plastic sleeve. Mara came on Saturdays. Walter Kim drove them to the trailhead once, claiming Evelyn's truck tires had the optimism of Daniel's nails. He packed sandwiches, 2 thermoses, and enough apples for a school field trip. "You're not climbing the ravine," Evelyn told him. "I wasn't planning to." "You brought rope." "I bring rope when people tell me not to climb ravines." Nolan took the rope and assigned Walter to watch the road crossing. It was the kindest compromise available. The search teams worked in widening circles around the last reliable signal. Nolan and the ranger checked ledges, drainage channels, and sheltered hollows. Evelyn moved slowly along the lower trail, looking for a notched ear between salal leaves, a spotted shape beneath fallen branches, or the unnatural line of a tracking collar against moss. She found deer tracks, coyote prints, and a scattering of grouse feathers. She found one tuft of tawny fur caught on blackberry thorns. Nolan examined it in his gloved hand. "Could be hers," Evelyn said. "It could be." He placed it in a paper envelope, but neither of them pretended it proved anything. At noon, they rested beside a fallen cedar. The forest dripped around them. Sunlight reached the ground in narrow silver shafts, warming the smell of wet bark. Mara unwrapped a sandwich and discovered that Walter had cut it into 4 perfectly equal squares. "He thinks we're 6, she said. "He thinks symmetry prevents hunger," Evelyn replied. Mara offered 1 square to Nolan. He accepted it with the solemnity of receiving medical supplies. The small humor lasted only a moment, but Evelyn held it close. Grief had begun to narrow her attention again, turning every sound into a possible answer. A jay dropping through branches made her heart race. The snap of a twig beyond sight brought her upright. Once she followed a line of movement through sword ferns and found a gray squirrel sitting on a stump, chewing with no concern for the hope it had caused. "You're not who I'm looking for," Evelyn murmured. The squirrel continued eating. By the end of the 2nd week, the search became less frequent. There were other animals at the sanctuary, other injured creatures, other calls from roadsides, barns, and yards. Nolan could not keep staff on the mountain indefinitely, and Evelyn knew it. She hated that she understood. Understanding had been no comfort in Daniel's hospital room either. The tracking collar was programmed to transmit for months, but its signal never returned. Nolan submitted Juniper's identification and release details to regional wildlife officers, nearby ranchers, forestry crews, and rehabilitation networks. Trail cameras were placed near game crossings and creek beds. Evelyn checked them with him. Most photographs showed darkness punctuated by white eyes. Deer passed at midnight. Raccoons investigated the camera housings. A black bear cub pressed its nose so close to one lens that the image became a blur of fur and curiosity. Juniper appeared in none of them. At home, the blue blanket remained folded over the back of Evelyn's kitchen chair. She had washed it after the release, though it was not dirty. The walls still carried a faint scent of cedar from the clinic. Some evenings, she placed it across her knees while reading. Other nights, she could not bear to look at it. She blamed herself in quiet, shifting ways. She should have questioned the weather forecast. She should have asked for another week of conditioning. She should have insisted that the release wait until the upper roads were dry. Then she blamed herself for the blaming, because Nolan and Lydia had made responsible choices, and Juniper had been ready. A wild animal could disappear without dying. A wild animal could survive without being found. Evelyn repeated those truths until they sounded less like facts and more like prayers. Mara visited after school one Thursday, and found her grandmother sitting at the table with Juniper's observation notes spread around the cold mug. "You're reading all of them?" Mara asked. "I was checking something." "What?" Evelyn looked at the pages. The first recorded weight, the time Juniper began grooming, the day she climbed the branch, the note about the red water pan, the words "strong response to enrichment" written in her own neat handwriting. "I don't know anymore." Mara sat across from her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Mara opened her sketchbook and turned to the drawing of Juniper beneath the fern. She placed it between them. "Maybe she's doing this somewhere," Mara said. The picture showed only the notched ear and amber eyes, hidden almost completely by leaves. Evelyn touched the paper near the edge, careful not to smear the graphite. Maybe. It was the nearest thing to hope she could manage. Summer passed. The searches became occasional checks. Reports came in from hunters and hikers, but none matched Juniper's scar, gait, and ear notch. One blurry photograph showed a bobcat on a logging road 20 miles south. Nolan studied it for a long time before shaking his head. Wrong tail pattern. Evelyn nodded. The disappointment felt strangely intimate, as though she had misplaced Juniper all over again. On the first cold morning of October, she walked alone to the old footbridge where the rescue had begun. Salmon Creek ran low and clear beneath it. The rusted wire was gone. Moss had covered the concrete support. Evelyn stood in the place where she had once held the flashlight. A raven watched from the rail. She took the peppermint wrapper from her coat pocket, worn nearly transparent after months inside her wallet. She did not leave it there. The forest needed no token from her. Instead, she folded it carefully and carried it home. By winter, Evelyn stopped asking Nolan for news every morning. She still listened whenever the phone rang. She still looked toward the tree line when driving Forest Road 19. But beneath the waiting, something harder had begun to form. She understood that Juniper might never return to any camera, receiver, or familiar trail. The bobcat's life might continue entirely beyond human witness, or it might already have ended somewhere beneath the firs. Evelyn had no way to know. That uncertainty became its own kind of heartbreak, not a door closing, but a door left open to weather, season after season, with no footsteps crossing through. 10 years passed before the forest returned Juniper to Evelyn. They did not pass quickly, though memory later folded them together like blankets stored for winter. Evelyn grew from 62 to 72. Silver replaced the last brown in her hair. The stiffness in her knees became a daily negotiation rather than an occasional complaint. She stopped volunteering at the library every Tuesday, but continued on Thursdays, where Beth still accused her of organizing the crayons by medical urgency. Mara finished school, studied environmental science in Eugene, and returned to the foothills with field notebooks, sturdy boots, and Daniel's habit of predicting rain with unreasonable confidence. Nolan's beard turned mostly gray. Lydia finally retired the yellow clogs after one split near the heel, though she kept them on a shelf above her desk as if they were part of sanctuary history. Juniper remained absent. There were reports now and then. A rancher saw a female bobcat with a shortened step near a meadow north of Salt Creek. A trail camera caught a pale muzzled animal beside a fallen pine. Once, Mara brought Evelyn a photograph from a regional survey and asked whether the shape of the left ear looked familiar. It did. So did 100 shadows when Hope had enough time to study them. None could be confirmed. Evelyn stopped expecting confirmation, though she never stopped noticing bobcats. Then came the wildfire. It began in August after weeks without rain, sparked by dry lightning high along the eastern ridge. By the third day, smoke had covered Oak Ridge in a copper-colored haze. Ash settled on porch rails and garden leaves. The sun became a dim red circle, and the air smelled of burned pine, hot stone, and something older beneath both, the deep mineral scent of earth opened by fire. The sanctuary prepared for displaced wildlife before the evacuation notices reached nearby communities. Outdoor enclosures were cleared. Transport crates were lined along the intake bay. Water stations were placed beyond the main property for animals moving ahead of the flames. Nolan coordinated with fire crews and state wildlife officers, while Mara helped map safe corridors around the burn perimeter. Evelyn folded towels. It was no longer work she could do quickly, but her hands remembered the shape of usefulness. She stacked each towel with the edges aligned and placed the faded blue blanket on a separate shelf, where it had remained through 10 winters. The blanket had grown thin. Daniel's crooked stitches still held. On the 5th morning, a fire crew radioed from a service road near the sanctuary's northern boundary. They had seen an older bobcat moving unsteadily along the fence line, avoiding the open ground but refusing to leave the drainage. Nolan went out with 2 responders. Evelyn stayed inside. She had learned not to follow every possibility. Outside, hoses dragged over gravel. A water tank clanged against the back of a truck. Smoke turned the daylight strange and yellow. Evelyn sat in the intake room with her green mug beside her, listening to the radio break into clipped voices. Visual near the cedar screen. Female, older animal, favoring right rear. Evelyn's hand stopped on the blanket. She did not stand. Not yet. Mara entered from the corridor, breathing hard from the heat. Ash streaked one cheek. Grandma. Evelyn looked at her face. Mara did not smile. She did not say the name. She only held out one hand. Together, they walked toward the examination yard. The bobcat had entered a temporary recovery enclosure through an open passage from the outer fence. No one had trapped her. Nolan had placed water inside, then backed away and allowed the animal to choose shelter from the smoke. She crouched beneath a leaning cedar branch. Age had changed her. Her muzzle was pale, almost white around the whisker pads. The rich tawny coat had dulled along the spine. One shoulder stood higher than the other, and her right hind leg touched the ground cautiously. Her sides moved fast from heat and exhaustion. But the left ear carried a crescent-shaped notch. A faint scar crossed above the right eye. Evelyn stopped beneath the overhang. The yard smelled of wet ash where sprinklers had darkened the soil. Smoke rasped softly in the firs. Somewhere beyond the fence, a helicopter passed overhead, low enough to shake water from the roof gutter. The bobcat lifted her head. Her eyes were still amber. Nolan stood several yards away with the water bucket in one hand. His face had gone still in the way it did when emotion threatened professional judgment. "We need to be careful," he said quietly. "Marks can resemble marks." Evelyn nodded. "She's dehydrated, possibly smoke exposure. We won't know more until she settles." Evelyn nodded again. The bobcat shifted beneath the cedar. Then she tucked her right forepaw inward beneath her chest. Mara made a small sound behind Evelyn, almost a breath caught against the teeth. Nolan lowered the bucket. Evelyn felt the years tilt. The footbridge returned. The clinic heat lamp. A gray water pan. A bee bumping against wire while 2 shadows touched across spring grass. Still, she did not speak the name. A behavior could repeat in another animal. A scar could be coincidence. Hope had deceived her before with less. She lowered herself slowly onto the old wooden bench beneath the overhang. The bench squeaked. The bobcat's ears moved. Not backward in alarm. Forward. Evelyn's thumb found the crack in the green mug's handle, though she had left the mug inside. The gesture remained without the object. Mara noticed and slipped her hand into Evelyn's empty one. Across the yard, the bobcat sniffed the smoky air. She looked toward Nolan, toward the fire crew by the gate, and then back toward Evelyn. A young firefighter shifted his weight. and his radio gave a sharp burst of static. The bobcat flattened instantly. Everyone froze. After several seconds, she rose and moved deeper beneath the cedar. Her steps were slow but controlled. She did not stagger. At the far edge of the branch, she stopped and peered through the needles. Only half her face remained visible. Mara whispered, "She always did like making people wait." Nolan glanced toward her. Evelyn's mouth trembled into a smile. She considered patience a basic qualification. The firefighter, uncertain whether laughter was allowed, looked down at his boots. A raven landed on the enclosure roof and knocked a pine cone through the mesh. It bounced once beside the water pan. The bobcat struck it with one paw. The pine cone rolled beneath the cedar. For a heartbeat, Evelyn saw the younger Juniper batting bark from her water and pretending the mess belonged to someone else. Nolan rubbed one hand across his beard. "That," he murmured, "is familiar." The bobcat settled again. Minutes passed. Evelyn did not call. Smoke drifted in layers between the trees. The sprinklers hissed along the outer fence, and drops gathered on the cedar needles before falling onto the old bobcat's back. At last, Evelyn turned her face slightly aside and softened her gaze. She let her eyelids lower once. When she opened them, the bobcat was still watching. Then the amber eyes closed slowly and opened again. One measured blink. The sound Mara made was not quite a sob. Nolan looked toward the ground. The firefighter removed his cap and held it against his chest without seeming to know why. Evelyn remained very still. "Juniper," she whispered. The notched ear turned toward her voice. 10 years of uncertainty did not disappear. They became something else. Not proof that Juniper had waited, proof that she had lived long enough to remember. Juniper did not cross the yard after the blink. She remained beneath the cedar branch, breathing through the smoky air while the people around her struggled not to turn recognition into pressure. Nolan lowered the shade screen along the outer fence, reducing the noise beyond it, then guided the fire crew toward the intake bay. Evelyn stayed on the bench. Ash had settled across her coat. Mara stood behind her with one hand resting lightly against the bench, close enough to help, but wise enough not to interrupt. Juniper watched them both. The old bobcat's sides rose too quickly. Her nostrils flared at each breath, and a faint rasp followed when she exhaled. The fire had not burned her coat, but heat and smoke had thinned her strength. Burrs clung along one flank, and the fur beneath her chin had gone gray with dust. Lydia arrived carrying a medical case and wearing plain rubber shoes. Juniper noticed immediately. Her ears turned toward Lydia's feet, then forward again, as if the missing squeak had violated an old agreement. Lydia stopped beside Nolan. "She remembers me too?" "She remembers your crimes," Evelyn said. The words brought a small warmth through the yard. Mara smiled through wet eyes. Lydia looked down at the quiet shoes. "I changed for her. 10 years late." Juniper blinked once, quicker this time, and lowered her chin. The examination could not be delayed, but it also could not be forced without need. Nolan placed a shallow water basin near the edge of the enclosure and withdrew. Juniper waited until he was gone before approaching. She drank in short intervals, lifting her head between each one to listen. Water darkened the pale fur beneath her mouth. When a floating cedar needle touched her nose, she sneezed and slapped the surface with one paw, splashing her own chest. For several seconds, she stared at the water as though it had acted alone. Mara pressed her lips together. Evelyn looked toward the smoke-softened furs, giving Juniper the dignity of not being laughed at. By evening, the bobcat had chosen the covered transfer den at the back of the enclosure. Its sliding door could be closed from outside without anyone entering her space. Nolan waited until Juniper was fully inside, then secured the passage and moved the den into the clinic. The old recovery room had changed over the years. The wooden platform had been replaced twice. The heat lamp was newer. A camera watched from the upper corner, small enough to disappear into shadow. Yet the low branch still crossed one side of the pen, polished smooth by claws and weather. Evelyn brought the faded blue blanket from the intake shelf. She held it while Nolan inspected the edges. The wool had become too fragile to spread beneath Juniper, and human scent was still treated carefully. Nolan folded it inside a sealed mesh cover and placed it outside the barrier near the observation chair. "For you," he said. Juniper needed fluids, respiratory support, and rest. Lydia delivered treatment while the Bobcat remained briefly sedated in the transfer den. The examination showed no severe burns, no fresh fractures, and no wounds that threatened her life. Her lungs were irritated. She was underweight. Arthritis had stiffened the old injury in her right hind leg. "She's ancient for a wild bobcat," Lydia said. Evelyn looked through the glass. Juniper lay beneath the heat source, one forepaw curled inward. She was always stubborn. Stubborn isn't a medical treatment. It has carried patients farther than expected. Lydia's expression softened. That part is true. The first night, Evelyn refused to go home. Nolan found a folding cot, but she chose the observation chair. Mara brought a thermos of tea and a bowl of soup from Walter, who had included a note reading, "Eat before organizing anything." Evelyn placed the note beside the mug. The tea went cold. Near midnight, Juniper woke fully from sedation. She lifted her head, stared at the clinic walls, and gave a low warning growl. Her muscles tightened as she tried to stand. Evelyn did not move closer. She tapped twice on the wooden frame. The sound was smaller than she remembered. Juniper froze. Her ears angled toward the observation window. The tension remained along her back, but she stopped struggling against the unfamiliar room. After a while, she lowered herself again. Evelyn rested her palm over Daniel's crooked stitches beneath the mesh cover. "I'm here," she whispered. "That is all." Juniper did not look toward her. Still, her breathing gradually slowed. For the next several days, recovery happened in quiet increments. Juniper drank without prompting. She accepted food before nightfall. She began grooming ash from her shoulders, though she tired quickly and left one patch untouched near her spine. Her lungs cleared little by little. Each morning, Lydia listened from beyond the divider, while Nolan recorded her breathing. Mara visited after field meetings and sketched only from memory, keeping the sound of graphite outside the room. Once, she drew Juniper's water basin with an angry cedar needle floating inside it. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "It's an important historical event," Mara said. Juniper, resting within view, flicked one ear. The staff discussed what should happen after healing. Returning Juniper immediately to the burn scar was impossible. The fire had stripped cover from miles of ridge and driven prey into unsettled corridors. Keeping her permanently in captivity would be considered only if age and injury left her unable to live safely in the wild. Evelyn listened without arguing. 10 years earlier, she had feared release because it meant losing Juniper. Now she feared confinement because she knew what Juniper had survived outside it. "She chose the drainage," Evelyn said. "We should let her tell us again when she's ready." Nolan nodded. "That's the plan." On the 6th afternoon, rain finally reached Oak Ridge. It came gently, tapping the clinic roof and washing ash from the cedar branches. The air through the screened vent changed from smoke to wet bark and cold earth. Juniper rose from the platform. She moved stiffly, but without help. She crossed to the vent, lifted her face, and breathed. Evelyn sat beside the blue blanket, holding the chipped green mug in both hands. The smell of rain filled the room. Juniper remained at the screen for a long time. Then she turned, looked toward Evelyn, and slowly lowered her eyelids. Evelyn returned the blink. Nothing had been restored to the way it was. Something gentler had been allowed to begin. The first sign that Juniper had not returned alone appeared on the sanctuary's northern trail camera 3 nights after the rain. Mara found the image during the morning review. She had been sitting at the corner desk with a mug of coffee and a stack of memory cards, moving quickly through photographs of raccoons, deer, wind-bent branches, and one curious black bear that had pressed its nose against the lens. Outside, the washed forest shone beneath a pale sky. Water dripped from the gutters, and the clinic smelled of damp cedar, warm grain, and the faint medicinal sharpness of Juniper's respiratory treatment. Mara stopped scrolling. "Grandma," she said. Evelyn looked up from the towel she was folding. Mara did not turn the monitor immediately. She enlarged the image first, then leaned closer until her hair nearly touched the screen. The photograph showed the edge of the burn scar shortly before dawn. A fallen fir lay across the lower frame, its bark blackened on one side and silver with rain on the other. Behind it stood a bobcat, not Juniper. This animal was younger and longer through the legs, with a darker coat and a clean left ear. Its eyes reflected white from the camera flash. One forepaw rested on the log, while its head turned towards something beyond the frame. Mara clicked to the next photograph. A second young bobcat appeared several feet behind the first. This one was smaller, with a pale patch beneath the chin and a faint strip of darker fur along the nose. The 2 animals stood alert, but not alarmed, bodies angled in the same direction. In the third image, an older female entered from the right. Her muzzle was pale. Her left ear was notched. Her right hind leg held slightly stiff. Evelyn placed the folded towel on the counter. For several seconds, no one spoke. Nolan came from the hallway carrying a feed bucket. Lydia followed, reading Juniper's latest chart. They gathered around the monitor while Mara moved through the sequence again. The images had been captured over less than 2 minutes. Juniper appeared first at the edge of the burn drainage, then vanished into cover. The 2 younger bobcats crossed after her, pausing separately to scent the same fallen log. One rubbed its cheek against the bark. The other lifted both front paws onto the trunk and peered over it before dropping back down. "They're too old to be dependent kittens," Nolan said. "Probably close to dispersal age." "But they were traveling with her," Mara replied. "Near her," Lydia corrected gently. "That matters." Evelyn studied the photograph. The younger animals were not pressed against Juniper. They were not following in a neat line or behaving like tame companions. Each kept space. Each watched a different direction. Yet all 3 moved through the same narrow corridor in the hours before Juniper appeared at the sanctuary fence. "She had a family," Mara whispered. Evelyn's hand moved unconsciously to the crack in the green mug. For 10 years, she had imagined Juniper surviving alone. She had pictured solitary winters beneath rock ledges, silent crossings through snow, and long hunting nights beneath the firs. That was the life people associated with bobcats, and much of it was true. They were independent, territorial creatures. Even mothers raised their young toward separation. But independence did not mean a life without connection. The photographs proved that Juniper's missing years had contained something Evelyn had never dared to imagine. She had raised young, perhaps more than once. She had found shelter, hunted enough to feed herself and growing kittens, defended territory, endured storms, and navigated roads, fires, and seasons no human had witnessed. Evelyn's eyes filled, not because Juniper had belonged to her, because she had belonged so completely to her own life. Mara touched the screen near the smaller bobcat's pale chin. "This one looks suspicious." "Of what?" Nolan asked. "Everything." "Then she has excellent survival instincts." Lydia pointed toward the larger youngster, whose front half was hidden behind the log, and that one appears to have misplaced the rest of itself. Mara smiled. Maybe it's camera shy. Evelyn leaned closer. No, it's judging the photographer. The lightness helps them breathe. They printed the clearest image and placed it beside Juniper's chart, though Nolan added a note reminding everyone that family relationships could not be confirmed without more evidence. He wanted no one turning a handful of photographs into a human story merely because the idea was comforting. Evelyn agreed. Hope needed boundaries too. Additional cameras were placed along the northern drainage and the unburned corridor beyond it. No food was left. No calls were played. The sanctuary did not try to draw the young bobcats closer. For 2 nights, nothing appeared. On the third, one camera recorded the smaller youngster at midnight. It stopped beside a rain-filled depression and tapped the water once before jerking backward from the splash. Mara laughed when she saw it. That seems familiar. Evelyn watched the young bobcat return cautiously to the puddle and strike it again. Apparently, water continues to cause trouble in the family. The larger youngster appeared later, scent marking a low branch, and then rubbing against it with enough enthusiasm to lose balance. It landed upright, looked toward the camera, and walked away with exaggerated calm. Nolan folded his arms. No comment. Very professional, Evelyn said. Inside the clinic, Juniper continued to recover. Her breathing had steadied, and she spent longer periods standing near the screened vent. When the wind came from the north, she lifted her face and listened with complete attention. Once, a distant bobcat call carried faintly from the ridge, a rough, brief sound softened by the wet trees. Juniper froze. Her ears moved forward. She did not answer. After several moments, she paced the length of the enclosure, touched her nose to the mesh, and returned to the platform. Her body remained restless long after the forest fell quiet. Evelyn sat beside the blue blanket and understood that recognition could pull in more than one direction. Juniper remembered her. Juniper also knew the young shadows beyond the trees. The two truths did not compete. They belonged to different parts of the same wild life. Later that evening, Mara brought the printed photograph to Evelyn's house. They placed it on the kitchen table beside an old sketch of Juniper beneath the fern. Walter arrived with a loaf of bread and studied the image through his reading glasses. "Those are her children?" "We don't know for certain," Evelyn said. Walter nodded gravely. "Then I will be uncertain with enthusiasm." He left the bread and refused tea because he had already had 3 cups, though he accepted 2 molasses cookies for the walk home. Mara stayed until dusk. As the kitchen darkened, Evelyn looked at the 3 bobcats crossing the wet burn scar. The photograph held no tenderness that humans could easily name. There was distance between them, vigilance in every posture, and the hard-earned caution of wild creatures. Yet they were there, together. Evelyn thought of Daniel, of Mara, of all the lives that continued after loss, without replacing what had been lost. Juniper had not spent 10 years waiting to be found. She had spent them becoming someone Evelyn had never fully known. Survivor, hunter, mother, and guide through a changing forest. Outside, wind moved through the orchard. On the table, 3 spotted shapes traveled beyond the reach of the camera, carrying the missing years with them. By October, green returned first along the creek beds. Fireweed rose through the blackened soil in narrow pink columns, and young fern tips curled open beneath the surviving cedar canopy. Rain darkened the burned trunks until they shone like wet iron. From the sanctuary porch, the eastern ridge no longer looked empty. It looked wounded, but working. Juniper had regained enough strength to leave the clinic. Not for the old burn scar, not yet. Mara and Nolan had mapped a quieter release corridor west of the sanctuary, where mature forest joined a protected drainage untouched by fire. The area held rock ledges, dense cover, fresh water, and several routes leading north toward the places where the younger bobcats had appeared on camera. Before release, Juniper spent 2 weeks in the large outdoor enclosure. Age had changed what readiness looked like. She no longer launched to the highest branch or crossed the yard with the quick, floating stride Evelyn remembered. Her right hind leg remained stiff after rest, and cold mornings slowed her first few steps. But she climbed the rock ledge without help, followed hidden scent trails, and disappeared beneath the ferns whenever unfamiliar voices approached. She still rejected the red water pan. Nolan had placed it in the enclosure by mistake while cleaning the gray one. Juniper took a single look at it, walked to the opposite side of the yard, and drank rainwater from a hollow log instead. 10 years, Lydia said, and she has chosen resentment. Consistency, Evelyn corrected. Mara added a handwritten label to the red pan. Rejected by senior management. Evelyn visited each morning, though she no longer stayed for hours. She had learned that Juniper's calm around her was both a gift and something that needed care. Familiarity could not become dependence now, any more than it could 10 years earlier. She sat on the old bench beneath the overhang, drank tea from the chipped green mug, and watched without calling. Sometimes Juniper remained hidden. Sometimes the pale muzzle appeared between sword ferns. On rare mornings, she settled near the far side of the enclosure, curled her forepaw inward, and rested while Evelyn turned pages of a book she scarcely read. The blue blanket stayed folded beside Evelyn, never inside the pen. Its meaning belonged to memory now. The release took place at dawn on a cold, clear morning after 3 days of rain. Mist lifted from the drainage in long white ribbons. Water ticked from salal leaves, and the air smelled of mushrooms, cedar bark, and clean stone. There was no crowd. Only Nolan, Mara, Lydia, and Evelyn went. The transport den was positioned beside a game trail below a rocky slope. No tracking collar was fitted this time. Juniper's age and the condition of the terrain made repeated pursuit more risk than benefit. Instead, remote cameras had been placed along the drainage, far enough apart not to shape her movements. Nolan opened the door by cord. Juniper waited. She had always considered human schedules optional. Lydia tucked her hands into her coat pockets. Mara watched the dark opening without lifting her camera. Evelyn sat on a low stump several yards away, Daniel's cap warm against her ears. At last, Juniper appeared. She stepped into the wet light and paused with one front paw raised. Her coat blended instantly with fallen leaves, stone, and the pale stems of autumn grass. She tested the air, turning first toward the creek and then toward the ridge. For a moment, she looked back. Evelyn lowered her eyes and blinked slowly. Juniper's ears moved toward her. Then she turned away and climbed. Her first steps were measured. At the base of the slope, she paused beside a cedar root and rubbed her cheek against it, claiming information and leaving some of her own. She crossed behind a moss-covered boulder, reappeared briefly higher up, then slipped beneath huckleberry and vanished. No storm followed. No receiver went silent. There was only the ordinary forest closing around her. Evelyn remained on the stump after the others began gathering equipment. She didn't blink, Mara said softly. No. Mara waited. Evelyn smiled. She didn't need to. That evening, a camera recorded Juniper drinking from the creek. 2 nights later, she appeared beside a rock ledge, head lowered toward a mouse trail. Her gait was stiff, but purposeful. On the 5th night, the larger young bobcat crossed the same camera frame nearly 4 hours after Juniper. The sanctuary staff did not call it a reunion. They called it shared habitat. Evelyn liked the honesty of that. Over the following months, Juniper appeared often enough to quiet concern, and rarely enough to remain wild. Sometimes weeks passed without an image. Then a camera caught her beneath snowfall, pale muzzle dusted white, or sitting on a ledge while rain silvered her whiskers. The younger bobcats gradually moved farther apart. One traveled north, the other remained near the western drainage into winter, leaving scent at the same cedar root Juniper had marked on release morning. Whether Juniper tolerated the younger animal nearby or simply used overlapping ground, no one could say. The uncertainty no longer hurt Evelyn as it once had. At 72, she had finally stopped demanding that love explain itself. Her own life settled too. She reduced her sanctuary shifts to 3 mornings a week and spent Fridays helping Mara coordinate native plant restoration along the fire corridor. Evelyn labeled seed packets, tracked volunteer supplies, and carried a whistle she rarely needed. Mara insisted she use a walking pole on steep ground. Evelyn resisted until Walter carved one from hazel and engraved the handle with the words, "This is not a medical device." She used it after that. Lydia continued visiting even after officially retiring, usually with pastries and unsolicited opinions about everyone's footwear. Nolan gave the old bench a new support brace, but refused to fix its squeak. Historical significance, he said. Lazy carpentry, Evelyn replied. The squeak remained. At home, the kitchen curtains stayed open after dusk. The photograph of 3 bobcats crossing the burn scar stood beside Mara's sketch of Juniper beneath the fern. Daniel's old lantern rested on the shelf above them, cleaned but rarely lit. The green mug still cooled beside Evelyn's elbow most mornings. Some things did not need improving. One December afternoon, snow began while Evelyn and Mara were checking young cedar plantings near the sanctuary fence. The flakes came slowly, catching in Mara's hair and settling along Evelyn's coat. A movement crossed the upper ridge. Juniper stood between 2 fir trunks. She was far enough away to be mistaken for shadow. Her notched ear showed briefly when she turned her head. She watched the women below, then lowered her nose toward the snow and continued along the slope. Mara reached for Evelyn's arm. Evelyn covered her granddaughter's hand with her own. Neither called out. Juniper moved through the trees with the quiet certainty of an animal at home, leaving small round tracks that the snowfall began covering almost at once. The following spring, Evelyn found the first new cedar growing beside the old footbridge. It stood no higher than her knee, bright green against the dark moss where floodwater had once carried broken wire and branches beneath the concrete support. Salmon Creek moved clear over the stones, and sunlight flashed across the current in small, restless pieces. Evelyn rested both hands on Walter's hazel walking pole. 11 years had passed since she had knelt in sleet with a flashlight shaking in one hand. Moss now covered the place where Juniper had been trapped, and the creek showed no memory of that night. Yet the place did not feel smaller for having changed. It felt complete. Mara stood several yards upstream, checking young willows planted to strengthen the bank. At 26, she now coordinated the sanctuary's habitat program, though she still carried a sketchbook in her field vest. Her hair was tied beneath Daniel's old cap, which Evelyn had given her the previous Christmas. "You're staring at that tree," Mara called. "I'm supervising it. It's doing very well without you. That is the ideal outcome." Mara smiled and returned to the willows. The answer stayed with Evelyn. She had once believed care proved itself by remaining necessary. Nursing had shaped her around that belief. There had always been another dressing to change, another frightened family to steady, another patient whose breathing needed watching through the night. After Daniel died and the hospital no longer needed her hands, she had mistaken usefulness for the only form of belonging she understood. Juniper had taught her otherwise. The bobcat had needed treatment, shelter, warmth, and time. Then she had needed distance. Later, when fire drove her back toward the sanctuary, she had needed help again, but never ownership, never a smaller life built to protect Evelyn from losing her. Love had survived each departure, because it had never depended on keeping Juniper close. They ate lunch on the bridge approach, where the sun had warmed the wooden guardrail. Evelyn poured tea from a thermos into the chipped green mug. The crack had widened slightly, and Lydia insisted it belonged on a shelf. Evelyn continued using it on gentle outings. She ran her thumb along the handle, while Mara showed her fresh trail camera images. The first held a snowshoe hare. The second showed a coyote crossing at dawn. The third had been taken 3 nights earlier in the western drainage. Juniper stood beside the cedar root she had marked on release morning. Her coat looked rougher after winter, and age had deepened the slope of her back. One amber eye reflected the infrared flash. Her notched ear remained upright. Behind her, blurred by movement and darkness, another bobcat crossed between the trees. "Shared habitat?" Evelyn asked. Mara nodded. "That is all we can say." "Good." She studied the image without searching it for promises. Juniper was alive. She was moving through her own country. That was enough information for one photograph to carry. Evelyn finished half her tea before it cooled, which Mara treated as a medical breakthrough. At the sanctuary that afternoon, volunteers gathered near the restored northern corridor to place a wooden marker honoring the rehabilitation program's first 20 years. Nolan had refused a ceremony until Mara promised there would be no speeches longer than 3 minutes. Lydia spoke for 6. She wore the old yellow clogs despite the split heel, now repaired with silver tape. Every few steps, one shoe produced a faint squeak. From the nearby fern enclosure, a recovering owl turned its head each time. Nolan waited until Lydia finished and said, "Some traditions should have been allowed to disappear." Evelyn laughed with everyone else. The sound came easily now. After the volunteers left, she sat on the old bench beneath the clinic overhang. Nolan's support brace had kept it steady, but the seat still squeaked whenever she shifted. The faded blue blanket lay folded beside her inside its mesh cover. Its wool had grown thin enough for light to pass through several worn places. Mara lowered herself onto the other end. "Do you think Juniper really remembered everything?" she asked. Evelyn looked across the yard, where rainwater gleamed in the gray pan. "Not the way we do. The bridge, the clinic, perhaps smells, sounds, a pattern of footsteps, maybe only the feeling that danger had been absent once. And the blink?" Evelyn considered that. The slow blink had become the detail everyone remembered. Visitors asked about it. Volunteers repeated the story. Some treated it as proof of gratitude, as though Juniper had returned after 10 years to say thank you in a language humans could recognize. Evelyn had never believed that. "I think she recognized enough to rest," she said. "For one moment, she didn't have to watch me." Mara leaned her shoulder gently against Evelyn's. "That sounds like trust. It may have been." They sat until the light began to leave the yard. Beyond the sanctuary fence, wind moved through young cedars planted after the fire. Their branches whispered against one another. A thrush called once from the drainage, and somewhere farther uphill, unseen beneath the gathering dusk, a bobcat gave a brief, rough cry. Evelyn did not rise. She did not call Juniper's name. She placed one hand over Daniel's crooked stitches in the blue blanket and let the sound pass through the trees without asking it to return. That evening, snow began over the western ridge. It settled softly on the restored creek banks, on the cedar beside the old footbridge, and along the game trail Juniper still used when the nights were quiet. By morning, the cameras would hold whatever crossed before them and miss far more than they captured. Evelyn had made peace with that. The most important parts of a life were not always witnessed. Some endured in a scar above an eye, a mug kept despite its crack, a granddaughter's steady hand, or the sound of an old bench answering a familiar wait. And somewhere beyond the sanctuary lights, Juniper moved through falling snow with her pale muzzle lowered to the wind. belonging completely to the darkness that had once carried her away, and for one merciful afternoon brought her home. The sanctuary grew quiet after the last door closed. Snow gathered along the roof and softened the gravel road until no tire marks remained. Inside the clinic, the gray water pan waited beneath the shelf, and the yellow clogs rested near Lydia's desk. The blue blanket stayed folded on the bench, holding the shapes of years in its worn wool. Far down the slope, Salmon Creek continued beneath the footbridge. It moved past the place where rusted wire had once held a frightened bobcat in the sleet. It moved past stones polished by 10 winters, past roots anchored in the bank, and past the little cedar Evelyn had supervised without being needed. The chipped green mug stood beside her kitchen sink when she returned home. She rinsed it, filled it with tea, and carried it to the window. Across the orchard, snow blurred the boundary between field and forest. No shape appeared among the firs. She lowered the curtains only halfway and left the porch light glowing, not as a signal, but as a small human answer to the dark. Somewhere in that silence, Juniper might have been resting beneath stone, following a mouse trail, or listening with her notched ear turned toward the weather. She did not need to be seen to be real. She did not need to return to remain loved. And now, as this story settles, may you let its quiet remain with you. Thank you for staying beside Evelyn and Juniper through every season. May the animals you have loved be near in memory, even when they are far from sight. May your heart find a safe place to rest. Outside, one line of paw prints crossed the snowy ridge, faded beneath fresh flakes, and disappeared into the trees. End of story.